Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Comishore, and today I want to talk about pitcher rest. Pitcher rest. Um, for those of you, this is really centered on those of you who are playing tabletop baseball games. More specifically, if you're using as played uh, lineups or as played pitching rotations, this won't be applicable to you either, or as applicable. But if you're trying to have a realistic pitcher usage for whatever league you have set up, if you're not using the as played lineups and as played rotations, or if you're just curious about how pitcher usage has changed over the years, then there is a way to find the answer to this question. This came up for me because I am running a solo league, Baseball Maelstrom. You can find the results over at baseballmaelstrom.com. And the league is really made up of teams of Hall of Famers and a team in each league of non-Hall of Famers, just great players that aren't in the Hall of Fame. And there are pitchers of different eras on the same team. So what I wanted to do was have a more realistic pitcher rotation usage based on the way the pitchers were used in real life, if that makes sense. And I've played the first 11 days or 11 games, or actually 12 days, I guess, in my league. And I've gotten to the point where I'm at my first off day, if you will. So just to show you my schedule here, this is you can just see kind of what the schedule is like. I have 8 teams, 4 in each league, no interleague play. So I'm here on April 13th in my league. You can see April 12th was the first off day for a couple of the teams. And so I'm actually using this off day as an opportunity to reset things, reset lineups, reset pitching rotations. Up to this point, I just went with a straight 5-man rotation for every team, and I pretty much stuck to that since I just kind of wanted to see how these pitchers performed. But I kind of wanted to switch things up because what happens is if you don't have a complex schedule with staggered off days, and you have an even number of teams like this, you'll always have the number one starters facing off against one another every time they pitch. So the number one starter on one team will always be facing the number one starter on the other team if you just stick with a straight 5-man rotation the entire way through. So I kind of wanted to switch things up and not have that be the case. The easiest way to do that, since the schedule won't really help with that too much, is to have pitchers be able to pitch on longer or shorter rests based on the number of days of rest they actually were utilized, how they were actually utilized in real life. And if you've done a search, if you do a Google search about pitcher rest, you'll get a couple of different answers to that question. One answer that you will get is that I think the school of thought or the main thoughts on this are that pitchers in the past were used on way shorter rest than modern pitchers. Modern pitchers are almost never used on less than 4 days rest, hardly ever. And pitchers in the past were used often with less than 4 days rest. So 3 days rest, sometimes 2 days rest. Sometimes they're pitching on back-to-back days. There are cases where pitchers pitch both games of a doubleheader, and that kind of thing in the past. So I've seen people respond that that's in fact how pitchers have been used. I've seen other people respond and say, that's not really how pitchers were used. They may have had that many games in between pitching, but because of the frequency of off days in the past, even in the past, pitchers were in fact only getting a start on average every 5 days, just like they are now. It's just they had more off days back then, so they were only pitching every 4 games, but still only pitching every 5 days. So there was that little bit of contradiction. And I know that there were cases where pitchers were being used, as I said, on back-to-back days sometimes, or more frequently than that. So I started to try to dig around to find out if I could figure out pitcher usage, other than how many games started. So you can kind of divide the number of games in the season by the number of games a pitcher started to get a rough idea of how often they were pitching. And that's one way of doing it. So if you have a modern schedule of 162 games and you had a pitcher with 40 starts, then that pitcher's pitching every 4 days, basically, give or take. Modern pitchers, of course, are not pitching anywhere close to 40, making anywhere close to 40 starts. Now, of course, in the past, the schedules used to be only 154 games or less. So you kind of have to divide that up based on the year of the pitcher and that kind of thing. So in my particular league, that's what I tried to do at first. And then the results didn't really come out as good as I wanted them to. And so I thought I'd dig around and find a more accurate method. And I did find more accuracy right at my fingertips. I didn't realize that it was there. So I'm going to show you how I found that and give you an example. Let's look at the Boston Splinters pitching page here. And you can see, Gaylord Perry is the slotted number 1 starter in this rotation. So what I wanted to do is see how often Gaylord Perry pitched and how much rest he should actually have. So Gaylord Perry, the card I'm using is I'm using Payoff Pitch Baseball. But this can be with any tabletop baseball game. I'm using 1972 Gaylord Perry. So let's go to Gaylord Perry's baseball reference page. And I have him pulled up here. And if you go over to game logs and you go to 1972 pitching, the year in question, and you click on that, they actually have, if you scroll down, they have his game log, his pitching game log from that season. Now up above here, they have days of rest. And they tell you exactly how many games he started with various amounts of rest. So this is exactly what I was looking for. So in Gaylord Perry's case, we can see that a majority of his games were on 3 days rest. He had some with 4. He had a couple with 1, and he had one with 5, but the 99, by the way, is just the first game of the season. That's why it's 99. But for the most part, if we look, it's really 26. So I was going for where their typical usage. So 3 days rest for him. And if we go down the game log, you can see days of rest in this column. And if you remember, there were 2 games that he pitched with 1 day rest, right? But if we look at his days of rest, we see that he pitched 7 innings, 1 game. And then he only had 1 day of rest before he pitched in relief, it looks like, on another game. And then another day of rest, and then he started another game and went 7 2/3 innings. So really, he wasn't pitching. He was pitching not on back-to-back days, but with 1 day in between. But that middle game in between was only 1 inning pitched, so he wasn't really a typical usage of him. But if we look down, we can see that typically it was 3 days of rest. So in Gaylord Perry's case from 1972, he was pitching on 3 days of rest. And if we look here, he had 40 starts that year, which makes sense. 162 games, 40 starts, 3 days rest. He's pitching every 4 days. So that's why on the pitching page, if we go back to Boston here, we can see I put 3 days of rest in there. So I'm going to use him on 3 days of rest, just like he was in real life. Let's look at another example. There are three typical examples that we'll look at. The other one I want to look at is Dennis Eckersley. Dennis Eckersley. So again, if we go over to Dennis Eckersley, I'm using 1979 Dennis Eckersley. And we go to Dennis Eckersley's baseball reference page. We go to game logs. We go to 1979. This was when he was starting. This was not when he was primarily a reliever. And we scroll down. We can see typically he had 4 days of rest in between starts. So in 1979, Dennis Eckersley typically had 4 days of rest in between starts. Yes, he had a couple of games, a handful of games with only 3 days rest, a handful of games where he had 5, and he had 1 and he had 7. But and then a 9 and the 99 just to start the season. And so my guess is if we look through and see when he had 3 days rest, well, I mean, he was pitching 9 innings. So there was only a short span of time here in July where he was being used with only 3 days rest. He had a span of games there where he was used with 3 days rest. But for the most part, it was 4. So that's why on my, in my case, I put him down for 4. Let's look at another case. Let's look at Lefty Grove. Let's mix it up and show an older, a picture from an older era. Lefty Grove is the 1933 card is what I'm using. And if we go to Lefty Grove's page, and we go to game logs, and we go to 1933. And if we go look at days rest, we see it's kind of all over the board. Kind of all over the board. We have, 10 games of only 2 days rest, 10 games of 4 days rest, 8 games of 3, and then just a mixture of like 1 doubleheader, 4 with no days rest in between, 5 with 1. So he had a mixture, right? So what I did for him was I actually looked at the games to see what was typical. And if we look, he started his first start of the season. The next game he pitched, he had 5 days of rest, 9 innings. The next game he pitched, he only had 4 days of rest, but that game he only pitched 5 innings. The following game he had 3 days and pitched 9 innings. And then he was used in relief the next day. But then after being used back-to-back like that, he had 5 days of rest before his next start. And then he had a span here where he was used in relief. So I kind of throw that out. He had a span here where he was used in relief. So if we go back to his starts, typically speaking, when he pitched 9 innings, for the most part, he was getting 4 days of rest before he'd pitch again. Occasionally, he'd be used in relief a couple days after a start. Now, there are some outliers here. If we look at July, he pitched 11 innings 4 days later, or 4 days of rest. So 5 days later, he pitched another 11. 5 days later, he pitched 10. And then 4 days after that, he pitched 9. But typically, if we look through, for the most part, he was getting 4 days of rest in between starts. Typically. With a few exceptions, as I said. There were a couple of cases where he'd get 3. That he was really only getting 2 or 1 if he was being used in relief, and then he may have been used in relief a few days after a start, and then a few days after that, he was used to start again. So typically, he wasn't being used back-to-back or, that kind of thing. Yes, he was being used frequently because he was asked to relief in between his starts on occasion. But for the most part, what I used for him was 4, because I think that was more typical of his usage. and the usage I wanted to use him for. Now, Catfish Hunter, Jim Palmer are 3.5 because they had a fairly even mixture of 3 days of rest and 4 days of rest. In fact, Jim Palmer, 1973. Let's look at Jim Palmer, 1973. Jim Palmer, 1973. So we go to game log, we go to 1973, and we look his days of rest. I mean, he had a lot of 3 days of rest, but he had also a lot of 4 days of rest. So because of that, I kind of put him in the middle. Yes, a majority 3 days, but there were so many 4 days of rest that he couldn't pitch probably the entire season with 3 days of rest in between. So that's how I used him there. So anyway, that's kind of what I did. So every team, if we look at just Boston as the example, every team I went through and kind of picked out the typical number of days of rest for the pitchers, for the starters. I did it for relievers too, because in my league, because I'm using Hall of Famers, there aren't enough relievers to go around, but there are plenty of starters. Well, not plenty, but so a lot of my starters, a lot of real life starters are being used in relief in this league to round out the bullpens. So Raleigh Fingers in this particular season was a straight reliever. He never started, even though, well, I can't say never. Maybe he had 1 or 2 starts, but not enough for me to make him a starter. Pedro Martinez, I gave him a 6 here, and that's because in the season I'm using, 2001 season, he was actually injured a majority of this, not a majority, but he was injured quite a bit of the season, so he didn't have very many starts or a typical number of starts that year. So I didn't want to just throw him in there in the rotation with a 3 or 4 starts or 3 or 4 days of rest because he didn't really have that many starts that year. I wanted to keep him in the bullpen for the most part and maybe use him as an occasional spot starter. So that's what I did. I kind of went team by team and calculated the days of rest for every, I went to Baseball Reference, pulled that up, and calculated that. But I guess bringing this back to Payoff Pitch. So according to the Payoff Pitch actual as written rules, here's the pitcher rest chart. And this is kind of why I did this, because according to the pitcher rest chart for Payoff Pitch, a pitcher who goes more than 5 innings, unless they're going over 9 innings pitched, so which wouldn't be typical. If they're going over 5 innings, they generally only need 3 days of rest. And that plus means that if their stamina is below 7, they need an extra day of rest. But what I've found is that the number of innings a pitcher pitches doesn't really have a big impact on how many days of rest they have in between. It probably does nowadays when pitchers are not pitching as many innings. But if you look at historical teams, I mean, pitchers were mostly pitching complete games or close to it. And they still needed, sometimes 4 days of rest, even only pitching 8 innings or 9 innings. So this chart is not, doesn't separate out eras or anything like that for typical usage. And so knowing that using this chart, pitchers, according to the rules, could always pitch on 3 days rest, that's why I kind of wanted to switch things up, because I don't think that's realistic either. So in my case, I'm going to be tweaking this so that pitchers generally need the same amount of rest they needed in real life. Now, one thing I may do is, if they have stamina of 8, which means you would check to see if they're tired in the 8th inning. If that pitcher pitches 8 or fewer innings, he has his typical rest. If he pitches more than that and he's a 3 days of rest pitcher, I might have him need an extra day of rest because he's gone over his typical stamina, if that makes sense. So I may flex things out that way. So that's, I think, where I just kind of wanted to show you, if you're curious about starter usage in your own game, and you want a very much more detailed way of figuring out how often you should be using pitchers based on their real life usage. Baseball Reference has this data. I didn't, even in Googling, I didn't notice that they had this data. I was trying to back into this in any way I could. But it's very easy to find. You just go to their page, you go to the game log tab, and then just pick whatever year whatever year you're using, and then you can just scroll down to the days of rest section and see typically how many days of rest they had in between starts. So I guess to answer the question, did pitchers in the past, were they actually used back to back or on shorter rest than normal? Yes and no. Yes, they were occasionally used. I'd say the usage was more, definitely, because they were often asked to either, they were completing games all the time, for one, and then they were sometimes asked to relieve in between starts sometimes. And typically they would only go on 3 days of rest instead of 4. But generally speaking, they were not used, unless we go way back, they were not used that much more frequently than modern pitchers in terms of days of rest. Now, innings pitch is a whole different thing. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If this was helpful to you, or if you have a different pitcher usage mechanism. I know different tabletop baseball games have different pitcher usage rules. I don't know if many of them take into account are as detailed as getting in days of rest like this and are as accurate as this, but this is a way that you can just see their actual usage and kind of come up with something on your own to mimic that. As I said, thank you for watching, and leave any comments down below. Be sure to check out my league at baseballmaelstrom.com if you would like to follow along. And if you have any questions on any of that, just reach out as well. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, have a great evening.